Picture a school library in the late 19th century. It's not the cozy book fair version that we like to imagine. It's an institution that exists to produce a certain kind of citizen in a certain kind of country with a certain kind of morality, and that morality is enforced less by argument than by fear. It's not scandalous, it's not some sort of romance novel, it's a history and politics book written by a woman who had spent decades watching how power works and then deciding she was going to write it down in complete sentences. The book is Woman, Church, and State, and the title isn't exactly subtle. It's basically her telling you up front, this is going to be about how women get controlled, who benefits, and how long we've been pretending it's normal. So Gage does something that should be unremarkable in a functioning democracy. She tries to donate it to a high school library. Just sit with that for a second. She's not asking for it to be assigned in a class. She's not demanding every teenager read it. She's saying, put it on the shelf. Let students access the idea if they want. Let them see an argument that history is not neutral, that morality is often politics in church clothes, and that the rules about women didn't fall from the sky. And a school board member reacts like she just tried to donate a lit stick of dynamite. Instead of accepting the book, he sends it off to Anthony Comstock. If you don't know that name, well, I did an entire episode on him a while ago, so you can go listen to that, but here's the quick version. Comstock made a career out of being America's self-appointed moral hall monitor. He was the guy you called when you wanted the state to enforce your idea of decency, especially when that idea of decency had to do with women organizing, women controlling their bodies, women having information. He's a media censor with a Bible verse and a badge. Here's how this plays out. Gage offers the book to the school, it ends up in Comstock's hands, and Comstock threatens prosecution if the school board dares to put it in a library. Notice what isn't happening here. Comstock doesn't refute her argument. He doesn't write a scholarly rebuttal. He doesn't say, actually, your historical sources are weak on page 312. He threatens punishment. Because that's always the move. When a woman is telling the truth too clearly, when she's making the system visible, you don't debate her, you label her dangerous and then make other people afraid to be associated with her. And the thing I need you to understand about Matilda Joslyn Gage is that she does not respond like a woman trying to be respectable. She does not respond like someone trying to keep the peace. She responds like someone who understands that respectability is often just another word for obedience. Gage publicly fires back, comparing men like Comstock to inquisitors, those old systems of righteous violence that call themselves moral while they police thought. She makes the point that Comstock isn't protecting children, he's threatening liberty, speech, press, and the public's right to read. This is where you can almost hear the collective clutching of pearls across the nation, because in Gage's era, the expected response from a woman was gratitude, softness, apology. If she must disagree, she should do it sweetly, carefully, in a way that reassures men that she's still safe. Gage is not interested in being safe, which is exactly why she's the perfect subject for the final episode of this arc. Not because she's a mascot for being edgy, not because she's a quirky, forgotten suffragist we're rescuing for fun, but because she shows us something essential about how women get punished when they refuse to behave. The punishment isn't always public, it isn't always a trial, it isn't always a spectacle. Sometimes the punishment is administrative. Sometimes it's a threat that keeps a book off a shelf. Sometimes it's a committee quietly deciding that you are a liability. Sometimes it's your allies choosing a version of the movement that's easier to sell, and sometimes that means taking you out of the story because you don't fit the rebrand. And that's what makes this episode different from a standard here's a forgotten feminist biography. Because Matilda Joslyn Gage isn't only a person who did important things, she's also a person who spent her life doing very particular kinds of work. She wrote history as evidence. She treated the past like a crime scene. She gathered doctrine, laws, trial records, cultural patterns, and built a case that women's oppression wasn't natural. It wasn't accidental. It was produced, maintained, and enforced. And then, because she was too honest about that system, even for the movement she helped build, she became politically inconvenient. Which brings us to the central idea of this episode. The most unforgivable thing a woman can be is unrespectable. Not sinful, that can be managed. Not scandalous, that can be sensationalized and sold. Not even rebellious in a cute, marketable way that lets society pretend it admires strong women. No, unrespectable is different. Unrespectable is when you refuse to make your politics palatable. Unrespectable is when you won't let church and state off the hook. Unrespectable is when you insist that women's freedom isn't just about access to the ballot, but about bodily autonomy, intellectual authority, and the right to exist outside the roles you've been assigned. Unrespectable is when you start saying the quiet part out loud. So today we're going to do something very simple. We're going to treat Matilda Joslyn Gage the way she treated history. We're going to look closely at what she wrote. We're going to take her arguments seriously as research, not just rhetoric. We're going to ask why those arguments scared people enough to summon a national censor. And then we're going to ask the question that keeps hovering over her whole legacy like a ghost at the margins of a textbook. If she mattered this much, if she was this central, this prolific, this intellectually foundational, why do so many people know the suffrage story without ever learning her name? I'm Professor Meredith, this is Bitchy History, and today's episode is Matilda Joslyn Gage and the Politics of Being Unrespectable. Let's start with the book they tried to keep off the shelf.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Before we go any further, I want to revisit the rest of this arc and kind of put it in context. Arc 2 wasn't just a grab bag of dramatic women from different centuries. It wasn't a tour of badass ladies that history forgot. It was a sustained look at a single recurring political phenomenon, what institutions do when women refuse the roles they're assigned. Over and over again, we watch the same choreography play out. A woman steps into authority that she wasn't supposed to have, spiritual, intellectual, civic, communal, and the response is not neutral disagreement, it's reclassification. She's not debated, she's relabeled. Saint becomes heretic, healer becomes witch. Girls learning leadership becomes a conspiracy. Women preaching becomes a threat to the moral order. Black lesbian feminists demanding full liberation are too divisive. The specifics change, but the logic stays stubbornly consistent. If a woman doesn't fit the role doesn't change, the women get marked as a problem. That's what this arc of the podcast has been tracing. Not individual villainy, not a few bad actors, but systems, religious, legal, cultural, that survive by disciplining women who step out of line. Sometimes the discipline is violent, sometimes it's social, sometimes it's reputational, sometimes it's archival, and one of the most effective forms of discipline, as we've seen, is simply controlling the story, deciding who counts, who gets remembered, and whose ideas get framed as legitimate. Which brings us to Matilda Joslyn Gage. Gage is our capstone, not because she neatly fits into one of these categories, but because she recognized the pattern and tried to explain it. She didn't just live the consequences of stepping out of line, though she absolutely did. She documented them. She theorized them. She traced the historical through lines between religion, law, and gender. She treated women's oppression not as a series of unfortunate accidents, but as something built, maintained, and justified over centuries. Where Joan of Arc shows us how authority gets revoked, Gage shows us how that revocation gets rationalized. Where witch hunts reveal the violence, Gage names the ideology that makes the violence feel righteous. Where Girl Scouts and Quaker women and Combahee show us modern versions of backlash, Gage gives us a framework to understand why those backlashes are so predictable and why they feel so familiar. In other words, Matilda Joslyn Gage isn't just another woman who stepped out of line. She's the woman who stopped and asked, who drew the line and who benefits from keeping it there? And that's why this episode is different from the others in this arc. Because from here on out, we're not moving chronologically across case studies. We're not hopping centuries or institutions. We're going to slow down and sit with one mind, one body of work, one woman who tried, very deliberately, to teach future generations how to read power when it disguises itself as morality, tradition, or common sense. From here on, this episode is mostly Gage. Her books, her research, her arguments, her methods, and the uncomfortable fact that once she made the system too visible, even for her own movement, she became someone history learned how to forget. So now that we know what kind of story we've been telling all along, it's time to hand the mic to the woman who tried to write the instruction manual. One of the biggest mistakes we can make with Matilda Joslyn Gage is to treat her writing as pure rhetoric, like she's just a suffragist with a sharp tongue and a grudge against the church. Gage was absolutely sharp, and she absolutely had a grudge, but she was also doing something more deliberate than venting in 19th century prose. She was doing research, not in the modern academic sense of peer-reviewed journal articles, but in the sense that matters most for historical thinking. She was assembling evidence, identifying patterns across time, and building a causal argument about how a society manufactures gender roles and then pretends that they're natural. Mary E. Corey uses the phrase church diggings to describe what Gage was up to, and it's such a perfect term because it captures both the method and the attitude. Gage is not dabbling at history, she's excavating it. She's going into the foundations, into doctrine, sermons, canon law, civil law, social custom, educational ideology, and pulling out the structural beams that hold up women's subordination. Her approach is basically, if you want to understand why women don't have rights, don't start with men are unfair. Start with the institutions that define what a woman is and what she's for, because those definitions are what make unequal laws feel reasonable. So she reads doctrine, what religious authorities have taught about women. She reads law, how those teachings get translated into marriage rules, property rules, legitimacy rules, custody laws, morality. And she reads history, moments of crisis, violence, and enforcement, where the ideology becomes visible because it has to defend itself. And she strings those things together as a chain of causation. Doctrine doesn't float in the air, it becomes law. Law doesn't stay on paper, it becomes culture. Culture doesn't stay abstract, it becomes enforcement. That's the engine she's trying to make her readers see. And her argument style reflects that purpose. Gage isn't writing as a neutral antiquarian. She's not collecting curiosities about the past just to admire them under glass. She's building a counter-history of how we got here because she thinks women cannot fight for freedom if they don't understand the machinery they're up against. She writes to persuade. She writes to equip. You can feel that in the way she stacks her claims. She doesn't just say women have been oppressed, she gives reasons, she gives mechanisms, she links consequences back to institutions that people are trained to treat as untouchable, especially the church. And by doing that, she's doing something very dangerous for her era. She's treating religious authority as a historical actor rather than a moral referee. She is, in other words, making the sacred political. And once you see that, you can map out her core claims pretty cleanly. First, women's subordination is institutional, not natural. It's not biology, it's not destiny, it's not the way things have always been. It's an arrangement produced by laws, doctrines, customs, and enforcement systems. Second, religion and law mutually reinforce gender roles. This is one of Gage's biggest intellectual contributions, and it's why church diggings matter. She's tracing how theological claims about women's nature get encoded into civil policy, and how civil policy then reinforces the theological claim by making it common sense. It becomes circular, self-justifying, hard to see unless someone pulls the curtain back. Third, when women step out of line, systems invent categories to justify violence or exclusion. This is where her historical imagination gets sharpest. She understands that power doesn't always look like brute force. Sometimes it looks like a label, a classification, a social category that makes punishment feel righteous. Heretic, witch, unfit mother, corrupting influence, divisive. The label is the tool that turns a woman's autonomy into a public threat. Gage is studying the same problem we've been watching play out in all of these episodes. Women stepping outside prescribed roles and institutions responding by inventing moral language that justifies containment. She's studying that process historically, building a case that it has precedent, logic, and repetition, and she's doing it with the urgency of someone who knows the past isn't over, it's not a dead era, it's a set of inherited rules still shaping women's lives. Which is why the best way to describe her isn't a suffragist who wrote a controversial book, it's this: a cross between a historian and an attorney that's cross-examining civilization. She's calling doctrine to the stand, she's calling law to the stand, she's calling cultural tradition to the stand, and she's asking the questions polite society doesn't want asked. Who benefits from these rules? Who gets punished when they break them? And why are we still pretending it's just morality or nature when it's clearly governance? So now let's move on to the next step, the work itself. Let's go and look at the book that got treated like contraband. If Gage has a signature work, the thing that explains both her power and her punishment, it is the book Woman, Church, and State. This is not a gentle suffrage tract. It is a historically argued attack on the long partnership between religious authority and civil power that defined women as subordinate and then built an entire society around enforcing that. Gage is not asking for a seat at the table. She's questioning who built the table, who benefits from it, and why women have been told for centuries that the table is just how it is. This is why the book gets treated like contraband. The Comstock incident was not a dramatic anecdote, it is a snapshot of how threatened people felt by what Gage was doing. Corey recounts that when Gage attempted to donate the book to a high school library, a school board member sent it to Anthony Comstock, who responded not with debate, but with threat. If the book were placed in the library, he would prosecute. Comstock did not need to refute her argument in print. He only needed to make people afraid to be associated with it. That's what censorship is at its core, not a counter-argument, but a warning shot. And what exactly was so dangerous about her argument? Gage's book runs on a deceptively simple mechanism. She treats women's subordination as something produced, not something that simply exists. She starts with theology, because theology is where culture often stores its most authoritative truths about women. Theological narratives about women's nature, women's bodies, women's morality become more than belief. They become the story that makes inequality feel right. From here, she follows the way these truths have moved into law, marriage law, property rights, the legal structure of the family, the boundaries of women's public participation. For Gage, these are not neutral rules, but civil expressions of a moral order that has already decided that women are lesser. Once law exists, culture does the quiet work. The rules stop looking like rules and start looking like common sense. Women are trained into them from birth. Men enforce them casually. Institutions preach them as virtue. People learn to treat obedience as femininity, dependence as safety, and silence as goodness. And when a woman refuses the script, enforcement arrives. Sometimes it's social punishment, gossip, ostracism, ruin. Sometimes it's religious discipline. Sometimes it's economic coercion. And sometimes in moments where the ideology needs to defend itself with terror, enforcement becomes spectacular violence. This is the spine of woman, church, and state. Doctrine becomes law, law becomes culture, culture becomes enforcement. It is also why the book is so unsettling. Gage is not describing isolated injustices. She's describing a system. If you accept her argument, you can no longer pretend that women's oppression is an accident, or that it can be solved with a single reform while leaving the deeper structure intact. You have to confront institutions that produce the natural order in the first place. Within the larger project, the witch hunt section is not a spooky detour. It is a case study, a point where the system becomes visible because it moves from everyday discipline into open persecution. This is where Gage offers what may be her most famous and most reusable interpretive method. Corey quotes her directly, "When you substitute women for witches, you understand the cruelty more clearly." She is telling the reader not to take witch as a supernatural category, but to treat it as a social label applied to a targeted group. Once you do that, witch hunting stops looking like random hysteria and starts looking like governance. Gage strengthens that argument with what she calls 3 striking points about how witchcraft accusations operated. First, the accused were overwhelmingly women, which should immediately make you suspicious of any claim that the category is neutral. Second, women's so-called peculiarities could be treated as evidence. That word matters because it points to what is really being policed, not sorcery, but nonconformity. A woman who is too independent, too sharp, too old, too poor, too socially awkward, too angry, too competent, too unwilling to perform the expected version of femininity becomes peculiar. And once peculiarity counts as proof, guilt is a matter of interpretation. Third, the clergy supplies the ideology that makes women's bodies and minds suspect in the first place. Religious teaching does not merely comment on the persecution, and Gage is telling, it creates the moral climate in which persecution feels righteous. What makes this section so powerful is that it shows the end of the pipeline. Theology produces suspicion, culture normalizes that suspicion, and then, when necessary, institutions convert suspicion into violence. But Gage is not only writing about witch trials, she's mapping what it means historically for women to step out of line. In her system, women step out of line when they possess knowledge that makes them less dependent, especially knowledge of bodies and healing. They step out of line when they refuse the expected performance of femininity, when they do not cooperate with their own containment. They step out of line when they are vulnerable enough to be scapegoated easily, as older or poorer women often were. They step out of line when they speak, when they dissent in public, when they refuse to be quiet enough to disappear. The witch hunt chapter of the book is famous because it's dramatic, but its real value is methodological. It teaches the reader how to read accusations as tools. It teaches the reader to ask what social work a label is doing, and once you learn that trick, you can apply it far beyond witchcraft. Once you see how she reads witches, you can see how she reads everything. If Woman, Church, and State is the book that make people clutch their pearls and call the censor, Woman as Inventor is the piece that reveals another side of Joslyn Gage's mind, not only her willingness to interrogate religion and law, but her obsession with the practical mechanics of how women's work gets made invisible. Because Gage isn't only asking, why are women oppressed? She's also asking, with the impatience of someone who has watched the same lie circulate for generations, why do people keep insisting that women haven't created anything? The essay begins from a cultural myth that was treated like a scientific fact in her era, that women lack the capacity for invention, for mechanical genius, for original thought. Gage treats that claim as both insulting and strategically useful to patriarchy. If you can convince society that women didn't invent, then you can justify excluding women from education, from trades, from professional recognition, from the rewards that follow creative work. You can keep women dependent and then call that dependency proof of their inferiority. So she goes straight at the myth. Her method is quite satisfying. She piles examples. She lists women's innovations. She points to women's contributions across many fields. The goal isn't just to celebrate women. The goal is to break the spell of inevitability. She wants the reader to feel the weight of evidence. Women have always created. You simply weren't trained to notice. But Gage doesn't stop at the look, women did things level. That would be too easy and, frankly, too optimistic. She's not writing a Hallmark story about hidden heroines. She's writing an analysis of how recognition works and why it fails women on purpose. So after she's established that women can and do invent, she turns to the harder question. If women are inventing, why does the culture keep insisting that they aren't? Her answer is structural, not psychological, not women lack confidence, not women didn't put themselves out there. Gage is blunt about the real constraints: legal dependency, property rules, marriage law, economic exploitation, and cultural ridicule that makes women's creativity appear either trivial or impossible. This is where her legal analysis becomes the engine of the essay. Gage understands that invention is not just a spark of genius. Invention, in a capitalist society, is also ownership. It is the ability to claim credit, to control a patent, to profit from labor, to be recognized as the author of an idea rather than the helper of someone else's brilliance. And she points out, with a kind of grim clarity, that women were systematically blocked from these forms of ownership. A married woman could create something and still have no independent claim to what she produced because her legal identity was entangled with her husband's. In Gage's framing, the problem isn't simply that men stole women's ideas in a dramatic, mustache-twirling kind of way, though that does happen. The deeper problem is that the legal structure of marriage and property made it easy for women's work to be absorbed into someone else's name. She emphasizes how easily a woman's invention could end up patented, sold, or controlled by a husband, leaving her without remedy. This isn't a side note, it's the whole point. You can't talk about women's lack of recognition as if it's a mere cultural oversight when the law itself has been designed to prevent women from owning the fruits of their mind. So the essay becomes a kind of blueprint for how erasure happens. First, you restrict women's access to education and professional spaces. Then, when women produce work anyway, you deny them the legal and economic tools to convert creation into recognized authorship. Then you ridicule women's intellect so that even obvious evidence of their capacity can be dismissed as an anomaly. And finally, you point to the outcome you engineered and call it proof. See? No inventions. Must be nature. This is why Gage is such a good capstone figure. She doesn't let you settle for surface explanations. She refuses to treat outcomes as accidents. She treats outcomes as evidence of structure. And it connects perfectly to the theme we've been tracing this entire time: women who step out of line. Because stepping out of line isn't about spiritual or moral offense. It's not just Joan putting on armor or a midwife knowing too much about bodies. Stepping out of line can be intellectual. It can be economic. It can be a woman claiming authorship, claiming invention, claiming the right to be seen as a mind rather than a helper. In Gage's world, a woman who invents is a woman who disrupts the story. She undermines the entire justification for dependency of women. She makes it harder to argue that women belong only in the home, only in supporting roles, only as moral ornaments to male achievement. And Gage understands something else too. When women's work is erased, it doesn't just harm individual women. It shapes what society believes women are capable of. It shrinks the horizon of what girls think is possible. It makes the future smaller. So woman as inventor is not a detour from her church-state patriarchy critique. It's another facet of it. It's Gage applying the same core logic to another domain. If you want to understand women's status, look at the institutions that distribute credit, property, and legitimacy. Look at the rules that decide who gets to say, "This is mine." And once you do, you start to see her broader argument coming into view. Women's oppression isn't just about denial of political rights. It's about denial of recognition, denial of ownership, denial of intellectual authority. In other words, it's about who gets to be a full person in public. Which brings us to the next turn in her story, and it's one that makes everything sting. The suffrage movement, increasingly desperate to look respectable and safe, begins to decide what kinds of women it can publicly claim. And Gage, predictably, is not the kind of woman you can safely sell. Now watch what happens when a movement decides it needs acceptable women, to sell the cause. If you want the most uncomfortable part of Gage's story, it isn't Comstock. It isn't the churchmen she skewers in Women, Church, and State. It isn't even the broader culture insisting women are incapable of invention while quietly living off of women's labor. The most uncomfortable part is that the suffrage movement learned to treat her like a liability. This is the moment when Women Who Step Out of Line stops being a story about patriarchy as an external enemy and becomes a story about how movements draw their own lines too. Because movements don't just fight for rights, they also fight for legitimacy. They fight to be seen as reasonable, safe, and respectable. And once legitimacy becomes the currency, the movement starts asking a question it may not say out loud, but absolutely answers with its choices. Which women are we willing to put on the front of the brochure? In the late 19th century, suffrage strategy increasingly leaned into the respectability bargain. The argument wasn't always cynical. Sometimes it was desperate. Sometimes it was practical. The logic went something like, if we look safe enough, men will grant us rights. If we sound moderate enough, the public won't panic. If we ally with institutions that have moral authority, especially churches and temperance groups, we can borrow their legitimacy and convert it into votes and influence. But here's the problem with that bargain. Respectability is never neutral. It always comes with a script. It always demands that you reassure power that you will not disrupt the deeper order. And Gage refused to sign that contract. Because what she wrote made her impossible to market as safe. She wasn't simply arguing that women deserve the vote. She was arguing that women's subordination had been historically produced by institutions, and she was naming those institutions with the kind of clarity that makes them nervous. Corey's framing of Gage's church diggings matters here because it shows why she became radioactive. Gage's critique wasn't a few sexist men, it was the church as a historical actor shaping law and culture and therefore shaping women's lives. That critique threatened alliances, not because it was inaccurate, but because it made the movement harder to sell. It's one thing to ask for voting rights while reassuring the public you'll use them to clean up politics like moral housewives with ballots. It's another thing to say in print that the moral order itself has been part of women's oppression. Gage also refused a particularly popular suffragist argument of her era, that women should vote because women are morally superior and would act as the nation's conscience. That framing plays beautifully with respectability politics because it reassures men that women entering public life won't threaten male authority, it will simply extend domestic virtue into the state. It turns voting into an expansion of motherhood, not an expansion of autonomy. Gage, very inconveniently, wanted autonomy. She wanted structural freedom, which means she had to talk about the structures. The church-state pipeline she maps in Woman, Church, and State is not compatible with a strategy that relies on religious moral power to legitimize the movement. If your strategy is to reassure church leaders that suffrage will strengthen Christian society, then you cannot have one of your major thinkers publishing a book that argues Christian authority has historically been the cage for women. So, as the movement consolidated and sought mainstream legitimacy, Gage began to look like a strategic risk. Corey describes her becoming increasingly out of step with the suffrage movement drifting towards conservative respectability and religious coalition building. This is the context for the post-1890 shift, when organizational consolidation created a more centralized mainstream group. You don't have to get lost in the organizational chart to understand the consequence. When movements unify under a single banner, they also create a single public face, and public faces must be curated. Gage did not curate herself. She refused to shrink her critique to fit the acceptable demand of the moment. She refused to pretend women's oppression was merely the absence of the vote, rather than a deeper architecture of law, doctrine, and cultural enforcement. She refused to be the kind of suffragist who promised men that women would behave once they got the vote. And that refusal brought the punishment that movements are best at delivering. Not spectacle, not drama, but quiet editing. The first mode of punishment is sidelining. Invitations change. Visibility changes. The movement's story begins to orbit other names, other tones, other kinds of feminism. The second mode is distancing. A movement that once contained multiple philosophies begins to treat some of them as embarrassing relatives, technically connected, but not to be introduced at parties. And the third mode is memory management, where the movement's leadership actively shapes what gets remembered as the movement and what gets recast as the unfortunate fringe. This is why the later repudiation of Gage's book matters so much. NASA's 1913 repudiation of Women, Church, and State isn't just a disagreement about a text. It's a signal about which parts of the women's rights history the mainstream movement wanted to claim and which parts it wanted to disown. It's the movement saying, decades later, that analysis is too extreme for our public identity. And if you're wondering why that counts as punishment, here's the answer. because repudiation isn't only about the book, it's about the woman. It's a retroactive attempt to control the meaning of her work and therefore control her place in the movement's lineage. It turns her from a founder into a cautionary tale. It turns her from an intellectual engine into an inconvenient ancestor. It prepares the ground for her to be omitted from the archive. Because once a movement has decided your critique is dangerous to its legitimacy, it stops quoting you, it stops teaching you, it stops placing you at the center of the story. Your work becomes something the movement survived rather than something the movement built on, and eventually the next generation learns a suffrage history where you are optional. Stepping out of line doesn't only provoke punishment from your enemies, it can provoke punishment from allies who need the line to stay where it is because they are building strategy on top of it. So let's say the quiet part out loud in the bluntest possible terms. Men didn't erase Gage alone. Her own movement helped because she made them nervous. And here's the kicker. Historians eventually named this exact dynamic after her. In 1993, historian of science Margaret Rossiter proposed a term for a pattern that is so common it becomes invisible, the systematic under-recognition of women's work. She called it the Matilda effect, and the definition is as sharp as it is depressing. It describes a sex-linked recognition bias in which women's contributions are downplayed, undercredited, or credited away to others. Women do work, but the rewards, the prestige, and the remembered authorship flows elsewhere. Rossiter's point is not that people always consciously decide to erase women. Sometimes they do. Often they don't have to. The system is already trained to distribute recognition in gendered ways. It assumes authority looks like a man. It assumes brilliance has a masculine default. It treats women as supportive, secondary, or exceptional rather than foundational. And when women are also politically inconvenient, too outspoken, too radical, too unwilling to perform respectability, the recognition gap becomes a sinkhole. Rossiter names the effect after Matilda Joslyn Gage because Gage is not just an example of the pattern, she is a person who spent her life describing the very mechanisms that produced it. She recognized how power converts women's labor into invisibility. She watched institutions deny women credit. She watched movements curate their legacies. She watched the public treat women's intellectual work as either suspect or non-existent. So when Rossiter came along a century later and said, "This is a pattern and it needs a name," naming it after Gage is almost painfully fitting. Gage spends her life documenting the denial of women's recognition, and then she experiences a version of that denial in her own historical afterlife. And it matters that the Matilda effect is not simply men stole women's credit. It includes the quieter forms of erasure, women being minimized in narratives, treated as assistants, treated as helpers, treated as too extreme to be centered or remembered only in relation to more acceptable figures. It includes the way institutions decide which women become icons and which women become inconvenient. Her work didn't vanish because it lacked value. It became harder to see because it was too sharp for a movement trying to look safe, and too honest for a culture invested in pretending women's oppression was natural. So no, Gage isn't just a case study for this arc. She is something more unsettling and more impressive, an early theorist of the problem. She saw the pattern, she named its parts, she documented its history, and then she lived the consequences of refusing to make her critique palatable. One of the reasons Matilda Joslyn Gage is so difficult to domesticate even now is that she doesn't only write arguments. She builds records. She doesn't just tell you what she believes, she preserves what she sees. She keeps evidence. And that matters, because Gage's life is a case study in what happens to women who are deemed unacceptable once the dust settles. They aren't only attacked in the moment, they are rewritten afterward, softened, reduced, turned into footnotes and awkward asides or names you only encounter if you stray off the approved class syllabus. So this is where it helps to look at Gage not as a theorist or a polemicist, but as a working historical mind in motion. Someone who understood instinctively that power operates through memory as much as through law. That's where the war scrapbook of Matilda Joslyn Gage, Witness to Rebellion, comes in. Edited by Peter Svensson and published in 2018, the book presents Gage's Civil War scrapbook as a historical object in its own right. The framing is explicit. This is Gage as witness. The scrapbook consists of newspaper clippings documenting the Civil War and its aftermath, curated by Gage and contextualized by Svensson to show how she was reading, sorting, and interpreting events as they unfolded. What emerges is not a passive collection, but a lens. The clippings reflect what Gage thought mattered, what she wanted to preserve, and how she understood the war and its consequences. This is history as it is being actively processed, not retrospectively smoothed into a tidy national narrative. Seen this way, the scrapbook fits perfectly with everything else we know about her. Gage was not waiting for history to be handed down from above. She was collecting it in real time. She was curating her own archive while events were still happening, preserving material she suspected might otherwise be framed, distorted, or forgotten. She was refusing to treat the official story as the only one worth saving. And that instinct, that refusal to trust dominant narratives, runs through her entire intellectual project, because Gage practiced rebellion twice. The first rebellion is the political one we've spent this episode tracing. She refuses to accept women's subordination. She refuses to treat the church as a neutral moral authority. She refuses to reduce women's freedom to a single polite demand for a change in law. She writes woman, church, and state, and woman as inventor as interventions, arguments meant to expose structures and equip future readers to recognize them. But the second rebellion is historiographical. It is a rebellion against who gets to decide what counts as history in the first place. Gage clearly understood something that still feels uncomfortably relevant. Oppression is not maintained only through laws and sermons. It is maintained through the narrative, through what gets preserved, through what gets framed as important, through what documents survive and which quietly disappear. The war scrapbook suggests that Gage did not trust the default archive to tell the truth, so she built her own. She acted as a witness, not a neutral observer, but someone who understood that testimony is political and that preservation itself is a form of power. That brings us straight back to the central theme running through this entire arc. Unrespectable narrators get erased. When a woman tells a story that threatens power, the story becomes the target. The narrator becomes the problem, and the record gets managed. Sometimes that management is loud, like Comstock threatening prosecution over a library book. Sometimes it is quiet, like a movement deciding certain arguments are too extreme to claim publicly. And sometimes it is the slow, grinding process of omission, where the story gets told and retold until the inconvenient woman becomes an optional part of the story. This is why archivists matter. This is why counter-archives matter. Being an archivist is how you fight disappearance. It's how you refuse to be smoothed away. In that sense, the war scrapbook belongs in the same universe as everything else Gage produced. It follows the same logic as her writing. Gather evidence, trace patterns, make it harder for power to pretend. If you can't stop institutions from trying to curate women out of history, you can at least make sure the material survives long enough for someone to notice. And that may be the most Matilda Joslyn Gage move of all, understanding that you might not win the argument in your own lifetime, but you can still leave behind a record strong enough to unsettle the story told by those who tried to erase you. So the real question isn't whether we admire her, it's what we do with the tools she left behind. If this arc has been a study of women who stepped out of line, Matilda Joslyn Gage is our capstone, because she doesn't just step out of line, she explains what the line is made of. Her central contribution is methodological. She gives you a way to read power when it dresses itself up as morality, tradition, or common sense. She teaches you to take the labels seriously, not as a description of reality, but as a tool. Her most famous move in Woman, Church, and State captures it in one ruthless substitution. When you read witches as women, the cruelty stops looking like mystery and starts looking like governance. And once you learn that trick, you can apply it everywhere. Witches, heretics, immoral women, hysterics, corrupting influences, divisive activists. The label changes, the function stays the same. The point is not to identify a real threat, the point is to justify punishment. That's the first lesson Gage trains us to notice. Accusations are rarely about the supposed crime. They're about enforcing boundaries. The second lesson is harder, and it's one that makes her personal story sting. Patriarchy doesn't only punish women in the moment. It curates who is remembered. It decides which women become respectable pioneers and which women become too much. It doesn't only burn the witch, it burns the record. Gage lived that. She helped build the movement and then watched that movement decide it needed a cleaner public face. She wrote the research and then watched institutions try to keep it out of libraries. She insisted women's oppression was structural and then watched herself become inconvenient to the official narrative of suffrage progress. And this is why the Comstock story is the perfect echo to close on, because a censored book is not just a censored object. It's a warning about what kind of knowledge society thinks girls should not have. And I'll leave you with the simplest version of what Matilda Joslyn Gage was up to and why she still matters. If Woman, Church, and State is too dangerous for girls to read, it's because it teaches them to see the pattern. It teaches them that when women step out of line, the response is rarely fair debate. It is labeling, punishment, and memory management. It teaches them that systems don't enforce obedience, they enforce forgetting. And Gage, being unrespectable to the very end, refused both. She wrote the map, she kept the evidence, she left it behind. And if history tried to misplace her, that's only because she made it harder for them to lie. So that's Matilda Joslyn Gage, a woman who didn't just step out of line, but who stopped, turned around, and started mapping the line itself. She didn't just ask for access. She asked who built the gate, who wrote the rules, and why obedience kept being mistaken for virtue. If Arc 2 has taught you anything, I hope it's that punishment doesn't always look like fire or prison. Sometimes it looks like omission. Sometimes it looks like a polite footnote. Sometimes it looks like being told, not now, not like that, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Gage saw that pattern everywhere. She named it, she documented, and she lived it. Which brings us to where we're going next, because up until now, this arc has been about women who were obviously out of line. Prophets, witches, radicals, organizers, women who scared people precisely because they refused to behave. But control doesn't always operate by punishment alone. Often it works better when it dresses itself up as affection. Next arc, we are shifting focus. Arc 3 is called Pretty Cages, How Love and Honor Kept Women in Their Place. And in this arc, we're not just meeting difficult women, we're reading the rule book written to keep women compliant, grateful, and contained. We're looking at the systems that didn't need to burn women because they convinced women to police themselves. We're starting with chivalry, knights, honor, protection, the soft focus mythology that says control is care, restriction is romance, and that a good woman doesn't need power because she has a man to protect her. We'll trace how that logic survives all the way from medieval codes to modern nice guy politics and workplace benevolent sexism. Then we're stepping inside the home, the cult of domesticity, the angel in the house, the gilded cage sold as destiny. We'll talk about who that ideal was built for, who it excluded by design, and why so many women never fit inside it in the first place. After that, marriage. Not the fairy tale version, the happily ever after, but the legal one. Coverture, property, wages, custody. Marriage as the original non-compete clause. We'll meet the women who tried to leave and watch how quickly society turned them into monsters for wanting out. And finally, purity, reputation, honor, the fragile social currency that could be destroyed by a rumor, a body, or a refusal. We'll follow that logic from fallen women in literature to modern slut-shaming and purity culture and ask whose virtue was ever considered protectable to begin with. If Arc 2 was about women who stepped out of line and paid the price, Arc 3 is about the systems designed to make stepping out of line feel unthinkable. Matilda Joslyn Gage ended her work warning us that the patriarchy doesn't just punish dissent, it trains desire. It teaches women what to want, what to fear, and what to call love. I'm Professor Meredith, and this has been Bitchy History. See you in Arc 3.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?